memories and hypotheses about these ancestors' lives against what I could find in the archives, and the recollections of others who had maybe traveled similar routes or faced similar experiences. Over time, I became interested in how and why certain details were told and retold and remembered, and why other details were buried or never told in the first place. In the distance between how the past was remembered and then how it may have actually happened, including family stories that tried to distance or silence experiences of slavery. And while the questions I pursued frequently differed from those that most interested descendants and local genealogists, I found ways to really appreciate the stakes of these different perspectives. History may be the enemy of memory, as one historian writes, but there are regions of the past that only memory knows. Along the way, one of the most persistent patterns I noticed, which you may have picked up on as well, is that the stories about slavery and freedom that I heard from my family were largely stories about men that my family took pride in as either quiet or not so quiet freedom fighters who escaped violence, purchased land, built schools, and fought back before heading to the Creek Nation in the middle of the night. I had probably heard the same story about Grandpa Coleman arriving by train to Oklahoma. This was something repeated over and over again. Grandpa Coleman arrived by train. And for the life of me, I couldn't figure out why that seems like such a non-important fact. But gee, if they're repeating it this many times over this many years, there's a reason that they're saying it that way. Of course, that's because other people couldn't come by train, or because they walked, or came in by other methods, right? And so kind of looking for those little turns of phrases within the family narrative, right, that really hinted at either privilege or claiming of a certain kind of privilege, or hinted at something else, right? Anyway, I'd heard those stories so many times before I learned to listen for words about his wives or daughters, Margaret Johnson Coleman, Belle Johnson Coleman, Ida Carroll Coleman, Lorinda Coleman. But the keepers of these stories very often were women. It was the daughters and granddaughters of the men at the center of these narratives who shared them with me as a child. And it's probably because I was sitting there at the kitchen table helping with whatever it was that I was the one that heard them. Growing up, I was blessed with really many phenomenal women who talked a great deal about the men in their family. And one of these was Marzetta Brown Wesley, who's pictured here. That's the second to the right, or the second from the right border on the bottom. My grandmother's eldest sister. And she served kind of as the official family historian for much of the 20th century. She held very tightly to very particular versions of the family story, serving as kind of a gatekeeper of sorts, the kind of first line of defense, like many others, against the constant threat of reputational damage. Like many of her generation, born in the 1910s, in and around the black towns of Oklahoma, Aunt Marzetta tended to tell only the best, or what she considered the most respectable parts of our history, for reasons that are, of course, quite understandable. Historian Darlene Clark Hine has noted the many dimensions of our past that African American women of this generation believed better left unknown, unwritten, unspoken, except in whispered tones. As Fisk Jubilee singer and pianist Ella Shepherd recalled in 1911, she wrote, "The slave songs were associated with slavery in the dark past and represented the things to be forgotten." These sorts of kind of silences and hidden transcripts and whisperings, right, formed the roots of the kind of politics of respectability that came to dominate much of the 20th century. Right? In the family narratives that my Aunt Marzetta shared, we didn't really talk about Mississippi. Mississippi was the past, Oklahoma was the future, and in the context of migration, really the past almost became a place, right? Mississippi was a place, and it was a time, and it was not to be returned to. So even for funerals or for other kinds of occasions, people didn't return. She rarely entertained questions about the family history before Oklahoma. In the 1970s, when my grandmother's cousin, Clifford Fields, used a payphone from Mississippi to call his mother, Nuna Mae Coleman, in Okmulgee, to tell her he had finally arrived at the plantation where he believed her father and grandparents had come from, she scolded him. She said, "What are you doing down there stirring up all that mess?" When family genealogist Terry Smith, who's based out of Oklahoma City, asked his mother about their relatives back in Mississippi, she shut down the conversation. About this generation in Oklahoma, Smith remembered, after they left Mississippi, they never went back, not for funerals, not for anything. And yet these buried secrets and silences haunted and shaped the present in Oklahoma. Oklahoman Ralph Ellison once wrote, "Our unknown history doesn't stop having consequences, even though we ignore them." This unknown history includes countless stories of violence and vulnerability, stories erased or obscured by segregation, by shame, by silence, stories that don't always conform to the narratives that we want, and stories that were not built to invoke pride. Shards and slices of lives, many of them were not stories at all. So I wanted to maybe share with you a little bit of a film clip before I close and then take our questions, if you're interested. So this was, I'm trying to decide which one to share, but over the course of this time period, my husband, Kari Jones, and I came back to Oklahoma a number of times, and we kind of documented a number of family reunions that took place. And some of you that are in this room, at least a few people, were at the 2014 gathering where we went back to this particular site where the South Gold Coast camp had been set up. So I'll just share two brief, very short clips, just maybe 30 seconds. This is first from my grandmother returning to Oklahoma, not to Oklahoma, but to this Brownsville cemetery for the first time since she was 5. So it had been 1928. This is her here. She was born 23. She was there in 28 when her grandfather, Thomas Jefferson Brown, had died, and she hadn't been back until this was 2007.
You have that.
It is amazing. You look amazing.
You have that hat. You have that hat, and you look so. Everyone's standing around you. Everyone's like listening.
So we climbed through barbed wire, of course, to get to the cemetery because it's on this property that appears to be has oil wells going up and down on it. She's 85. And this is Clifford, who I talked about.
Oh, you won't be able to get up, guys. You may sit up and feel he's embarrassed. What did you do, twisted?
Anyway, we get all the way up there, and then we see all of these gravesites for the first time now. So that was Julia Simon's stone.
So Oklahoma, so this woman's gravesite says they didn't know that you had ever been there before, I guess is what I'm saying.
Mama had Barbara in her arms. I would be nursing her. If not nursing her, she was a tiny baby. I'm assuming I was about 5.5 years old. But I was aware.
You don't remember seeing him?
No. I only had heard stories how he died. I think he would look a lot like Uncle Tom, but lighter.
Okay.
You can see how the rope.
And then I'll show you one last clip from 2014, 7 years later. Is it possible to turn the lights down a little bit in the back for this one? Okay. So Monroe Coleman ultimately passed away in a segregated hospital in Okmulgee. Is anyone familiar with that hospital? It looks like this. Yeah. So he passed away ultimately in this building, in that room on the top right there. We were able to go in there because there was someone in Okmulgee who's a friend of the family who was trying to work to make it into a museum. And kind of see what was going on the inside. And of course, the hospital room still looked like they had been untouched really since it had been shut down. And if you think about the story of his life, he was born, on this plantation where his mother had been enslaved in Mississippi, and he died in, a segregated black hospital in the 1940s. Right? You would never guess that in between there. There's this moment when he's, helping to finance this Back to Africa movement, and actually he goes and lives for over a year in the Gold Coast, right? So part of the, the story that I'm interested in is kind of what we miss when we only look at the beginnings and the endings, and we miss so much in the middle. So just to conclude here, I'll show you just a part of this where we go to that hospital and then we have a gathering of, I don't know how many people we had last in 2014, maybe 120, 130 people, and some of them went back to this grave site that was attached to the SAM movement.
This is the room people sang and died.
When they returned through Ellis Island, coming back in 1915.
It's been 100 years, almost to the week that they left for the Gold Coast. I don't believe anyone else has marked it as such. We were thinking maybe we just have a moment of silence here in memory of what they were hoping to achieve, what they did achieve, and of their lives.
All right, so I'll end there. Thank you all very much. This is just a quote that I like about family history. Family history being similar to architecture in certain ways. Like architecture, it is quiet, it encompasses, but does not necessarily demand attention. It can also suddenly loom into consciousness. One can go about one's life with no thought of the past, and then, as if waking from a dream, be astonished to see that you are living within its enclosure. I was in my 30s when I began to perceive that my own life was encompassed in this way. At first, this seemed to be a form of bondage, but it turned out to be a gift. And all family history, it seems to me, must be a gift in a similar way. So I welcome your questions or comments or hear about your own work.
Some of them went to Africa, stayed for a while, and came back. How long were they there?
There was a group of about 60 delegates that went, and the movement quickly fell apart because it coincided, speaking to the other event Michelle was speaking about with the centennial of World War I, it coincided with the outbreak of World War I in 1914. And so they were prevented from landing for a number of months. They ran out of food and money in some cases. They were charged a head tax by the British government, colonial government, which controlled the Gold Coast at the time. Many people, there was an influenza wave. There's many, many stories about how it fell apart, but much of it was kind of structural in that way.
Did they ever make land?
Yes.
Can you repeat any questions that you're asking?
Sure.
And it's about 7:20.
Yeah.
So about 10 minutes.
Okay. So the question was about who stayed, who actually made it to Gold Coast and who stayed. And I was saying that about 60 of them went as delegates, and many more were waiting behind in Galveston and also in Oklahoma for the next journey over. But that next ship never went. Monroe Coleman did make it over with his wife and 2 of his kids on that first trip, and they stayed for about a year. Yeah. They came back via Ellis Island.
Same ship.
No, actually, the ship was no longer seaworthy. Something had happened to the ship, so they came by Liverpool and another ship. Other questions? I know there's a lot.
Did your family participate in trail tours, or did they come at a different time?
The ones that I have traced came at a different time. The question was about the Trail of Tears and whether the family was involved in the Trail of Tears. Now, of course, in terms of people who were present in the in Indian Territory in early Oklahoma who were of African descent, a portion of them had come, as you know, as part of Indian removal, forced Indian removal. Some had come later, 1870, 1880, 1890, and those were very different stories, right, in terms of their relationship to Native peoples here and to the nations, and also in terms of land and community formation. Yeah. The ones I traced for the most part came after, although they were related to also Pyro Brunner, whose family did come as part of Indian removal. So they sometimes, the families that ended up were partly, quote unquote, stateside, coming from the U.S., and partly had come earlier. Because of what happens in the 20th century, right, many of these histories get segmented, even within families, right? So you don't have access necessarily to the same stories. So the stories that I heard growing up were all the stories about Mississippi and coming into Oklahoma that way. And it took some digging to learn that these other stories were actually part of the story too. Yeah. Thanks. Yes?
I'm going to try to get my question right, but I've lived in Tulsa for 6 years, and coming from a sort of northeastern background, I really love Tulsa and I love Oklahoma for many reasons, one of which being the space and time that we have here. I think a popular Tulsa narrative that I hear from people is that they love growing up in Tulsa, but then they have to leave, but then they come back to Tulsa. It's like people feel like they reach a glass ceiling here, but then come back and they say, oh, Tulsa was a great place to grow up. But lately I've been asking sort of the same question to people of color who live in Tulsa, and I say, if you could have chosen any city to grow up in, would you have chosen Tulsa? And overwhelmingly from people of color, Black Tulsans, I hear no, that they would not have chosen Tulsa to grow up in, and that they would have chosen any other city, maybe with greater Black representation, is what I hear. And it makes me sad, because I might be someone who has mixed children one day, and I consider Tulsa to be a place that I'm very proud of and that I would love to live. But how can, and knowing also that Oklahoma really has a Black history and belongs to Black people in a way that I don't know that all of our Black children today feel, especially since we're still very segregated and suffer a lot, still from everything. So I wonder, what, as an educator also, and as someone who really does love the city, and as a millennial who maybe doesn't feel, as a white millennial who maybe doesn't feel racism in the same way, what might we do to have children of color know that Tulsa belongs to them and not Oklahoma belongs to them?
Thank you for that question. I think everyone heard it. I don't have to repeat it. I think that question would be better answered by Tulsans in the room probably than by me, since I did not grow up here. But I'll just say very, very briefly that, as I said at the beginning, I think family history is an incredibly important resource. We can teach our children. I know this because I have a 7-year-old son, and for instance, after the last election, in any given moment, the stories I'm telling my son are changing. They don't stay the same, right? We tell stories because we want to either protect our child, or we want to help them, or we want to instill them with pride, or we want them to know who they are and where they come from, right? And there's reasons why we tell stories, and I think stories are incredibly powerful. But I would really defer to everyone in the room as to their own experiences with the place. Yeah. Yes, go ahead.
Well, my family had their reunion in Clearview last month.
Ah.
And actually, I've been in the family for 36 years, and they never had it in Clearview. They always had it somewhere with somebody else. But this year we decided that we wanted to have it in Clearview because we have Founders Day there now. Mm-hmm. And if you went there, you see that there's a museum there.
You know Shirley Nero? She has been really incredibly helpful.
My husband his family was a founding family. Clearview. They came on covered wagon because the 40 acres in Louisiana where I'm from was taken away from them from white people. So 9 kids, mother and father, covered wagon came because there was a conflict. Somebody got shot and it wasn't Black. So that's why they ended up here, but the rest of the family is in Louisiana. So one of the things that we figured out when we were all there in Clearview, it took a lot of work to get everybody, because they said, why we got Clearview? Ain't nobody here. But the reason we did it was because when they had the Clearview Founders Day, they had the Oklahoma Black Towns tour and all that was there. And we wanted them to see it. So we had to bring it in from Oklahoma City, had it set up.
Absolutely.
And they loved, we had the trivia, we had everybody to tell them about going to Clearview when they were younger. And the thing is that we still have our family home there on 180 acres. Nobody lives there, but we had it restored, so when we want to go for the Clearview Rodeo, we have our home to go to. And my brother-in-law has his 120 acres still there. My uncle, I work for the oil company, Tufts Petroleum Company, that's how I met my husband. And the oil companies did take a lot of their land. Matter of fact, I worked on the leases that my uncle lived on. He had free gas though. We did have free gas with his 13 kids. But one of the things about it is that a lot of people came to Tulsa because they had to come to Tulsa because it wasn't anything about it there. And they still love where they came from. She's from Tallahassee. If you say Tallahassee, it's Tallahassee. And she's from Haskell. Wherever they're from, they'll tell you they're from there. You know, they live in Tulsa. When they have a funeral or when they have a whatever, they go back. And we go back to those cemeteries that's way back up in some woods somewhere. That's where they want to be buried.
Yep,
absolutely.
absolutely.
Because that's still their home. Now, Tulsa is a place where they live, but their home is still where their people are, even if it's just
Right. Yeah.
whatever. You know, because for Clearview, it's the gym. Everything's in the gym. The funeral home, the family reunion, your 90th birthday,
The seniors,
whatever, it's in that gym. So that when they say love, one of the things that we never, because see, people still say Tulsa raised riot, but for us, it's still a massacre.
Yep.
And it's not going to change. And so that's why home is still home when it comes to Oklahoma. And anytime you go to all black town, it's still like, well, you know, because we have four people in one family married 4 in the other, so they have to have the reunion together. They won't let the other one have it. We try to have it by ourselves, and we have to join with them because 4 people married 4 people. And so that's what it is. You have to teach your kids that it's okay to make Tulsa a melting pot, but it's okay still to be from where you are and to love where you're now.
Yeah.
And I can speak for everybody tells me that I know everybody, but everybody came from the country. So you grew up with them, they ended up here in Tulsa.
Yeah.
So when you see someone that you've known all of your life that's in a different town, you know them. So I can go to North Tulsa and be at home because I know them.
Yeah.
I'd like to invite you to watch the Clearview Rodeo, which is
Oh, yes.
family.
So-
I'm married to Romeo Albert.
So can I say one thing? Can I say one last thing?
Yeah.
So I really appreciate these comments, and I wish we had a lot more time for more. So please chat with me after if you're available. I want to say that for my family in particular, and I think for a lot of families, people spread out after the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl and the rest of it, right? So and everything that happened here in Tulsa, and so. My family members, for the most part, they were in Chicago, they were in LA, they were in, other parts of California, they were in New York. And so since the 1940s and 50s, they've been coming back for the rodeo, either the Bowley one or another one, right? And they also come back for, other kinds of reunions. But it's been Oklahoma, it's been a return of people, kind of an Oklahoma diaspora, right? Returning again and again. And I really think that's just an important tradition to hold on to. So I'm really glad to hear it.
So, I hate to do this because I know we can just go all night long with fabulous stories, which I think brings me to my next point. As executive director of the Tulsa Historical Society, and I would say that since our inception in the 1960s, that there was thought that it was about perpetuating the good family name. That means the white majority. But I stand before you today to tell you that our staff, our board is committed absolutely to telling all of Tulsa's stories. But we can't do it without you. So I think tonight, and your wonderful story about Clearview and your family and et cetera, you have got to record these in some form or fashion. I was asked to give the plenary talk at the John Paul Franklin Symposium, and the subject that they gave me was the dangers of misrepresentation in history. And so I thought a lot about that. And what I came to is, if we don't, it is my job to provide time and space to collect stories. But I can't do this without you. You have to help me. You have to tell those stories, because if you don't tell those stories, if you don't record them, granted, we're not going to be able to do it as eloquently as Dr. Field, but if you don't record these, then we're leaving Tulsa's history with not the whole picture, right? Right? So, what we also want to know are the good times. I mean, absolutely, we are documenting, I contend much of history is really horrible stuff. It's about somebody pounding on somebody else and taking their stuff, right? But let's not just record all of that. I want to know what Sunday family dinners are about. I want to know what it's like when a new child is born into your family. I mean, it's endless, but you have got to tell the story. And we hope that you would consider leaving your story with the Tulsa Historical Society and Museum. I'm begging you, leave your story with us. We can help you with that. We have a lot of volunteers. Come volunteer for us and reach out. And this is about community, and we can't all be community if we don't all chip in. So, yes, ma'am.
Michelle, and we don't have to record it at home and bring the results from us. We can record right
Yeah.
here.
We can come in with a sister, with an aunt, with your mother. We have a recording studio set up upstairs. All we do is do the test sound, and we push a button, and you have a conversation. One of my favorites is a grandmother telling her grandson how to make homemade biscuits. I mean, so the sky's the limit, but please, I am begging you, know your story, learn your story, and tell your story. So with that, would you please give again, she'll be tomorrow night at Magic City Books in the Living Arts. We think it starts at 6:30.
No, it's at 7.
It starts at 7.
It's at Living Arts.
At Living Arts. So 7 o'clock tomorrow night. Come early and get a seat. I'm glad I'm going to. Again, thank you, Dr. Field.
Dr. Field.